Dr. George Nichopoulos sat in his Memphis office on March 12, 1967, writing out a prescription that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The patient was Elvis Presley, who had a show that evening and was complaining about exhaustion. The prescription was for amphetamines, stimulants that would give Elvis the boost he needed. Dr. Nick assured Elvis the pills were perfectly safe when used as directed. That night, Elvis gave one of the best performances of his career. The energy was electric, his movements sharp, his voice powerful. Everyone marveled at how Elvis had overcome his fatigue. Elvis himself felt amazing, and when the high wore off and the crash came, Elvis knew exactly who to call for more. 10 years later, on August 16, 1977, Dr. Nichopoulos received the call every doctor dreads. Elvis Presley had been found dead in his Graceland bathroom. He was 42 years old. The official cause would be listed as cardiac arrhythmia. But Dr. Nick knew the truth. Elvis had died from years of prescription drug abuse, and Dr. Nick had been writing those prescriptions from the very beginning. In the years between that first prescription in 1967 and Elvis's death in 1977, Dr. Nichopoulos had written thousands of prescriptions for Elvis. Amphetamines, barbiturates, painkillers, sedatives, a cocktail of medications that kept Elvis functioning, but slowly destroyed him. And Dr. Nick had watched it happen, had enabled it, even as he told himself he was helping. But that first prescription in March 1967, that was the one that changed everything. That was the moment when a legitimate relationship crossed a line it would never come back from. That was the prescription Dr. Nick would spend the rest of his life regretting. Elvis had hired Dr. George Nichopoulos in 1967 to be his personal physician. It seemed like a reasonable arrangement. Elvis was constantly touring, constantly performing, constantly under enormous physical and mental stress. Having a doctor on call made sense for someone with his demanding schedule. Dr. Nick was a respected physician in Memphis, someone who'd built a solid reputation treating regular patients with regular problems. But Elvis Presley wasn't a regular patient. Elvis was the most famous entertainer in the world, surrounded by yes-men and enablers, living in a bubble where normal rules didn't apply. And Dr. Nick was about to discover that being Elvis Presley's doctor meant something very different from being anyone else's doctor. The first few months were relatively normal. Dr. Nick treated Elvis for minor ailments, provided basic medical care, monitored his health. But then came that day in March when Elvis had a show and was exhausted, when he asked Dr. Nick if there was anything that could help him get through the performance. And Dr. Nick, wanting to help his famous patient, wanting to solve the problem, wrote that prescription for amphetamines. "Just for tonight," Dr. Nick told Elvis, "just to get you through this one show. Then you need to rest." Elvis nodded and agreed, but both of them were lying to themselves. There would always be another show, another reason Elvis needed help getting through just one more performance, and Dr. Nick would always be there to write the prescription. That first night, the pills worked exactly as intended. Elvis took them an hour before the show, felt the surge of energy, performed brilliantly. But when the show ended and the high wore off, Elvis didn't feel rested. He felt crashed, depleted, worse than before. And the only thing that made him feel better was more pills. Over the next few months, Elvis started asking for the pills more frequently, not just for shows, but for rehearsals, recording sessions, social events. Dr. Nick watched the requests increase and felt concern. This was supposed to be occasional, emergency use only. But Elvis was using them regularly now, his body building tolerance, requiring higher doses. Dr. Nick tried to talk to Elvis about cutting back, but Elvis had an answer for every objection. The pills helped him perform better. They helped him maintain his schedule. They were prescription medications, not street drugs. Wasn't that why Elvis had hired Dr. Nick? The logic was circular, but Dr. Nick found himself agreeing. He told himself he was managing Elvis's medication use. If Dr. Nick didn't prescribe the pills, Elvis would find another doctor who would. At least this way, Dr. Nick could monitor dosages, watch for interactions, try to keep things under control. But things weren't under control. By late 1968, Elvis was using amphetamines daily. When the stimulants made sleep impossible, he needed barbiturates. When the barbiturates made him groggy, he needed more amphetamines. The cycle fed itself, and Dr. Nick was caught in the middle, writing prescription after prescription. Elvis's weight fluctuated wildly. His moods became erratic. He'd be euphoric one moment, depressed the next. His sleep patterns were destroyed. He'd stay awake for days, then crash and sleep for 20 hours. His skin took on an unhealthy pallor. His eyes developed a haunted look. Everyone around Elvis could see the changes, but nobody wanted to confront the king and risk being fired, being cut out of the lucrative Elvis universe. Dr. Nick justified his prescribing practices with various rationalizations. Elvis was under enormous stress. His schedule was punishing. The expectations on him were inhuman. The pills helped him function in circumstances that would have broken a normal person. Without the medications, Elvis wouldn't be able to maintain his career, and his career was all he had. Dr. Nick was preventing a total breakdown by managing Elvis's pharmaceutical needs. These justifications became easier as the years passed and Dr. Nick became more entrenched in Elvis's world. He traveled with Elvis, lived in Elvis's bubble, became dependent on Elvis's generosity. The lines between doctor and friend, between medical professional and enabler, blurred and disappeared. Dr. Nick wasn't just Elvis's physician anymore. He was part of the Memphis Mafia, part of the machinery that kept Elvis Presley functioning at all costs. By the early 1970s, Elvis was taking dozens of pills a day. Uppers to wake up, downers to sleep, painkillers for various ailments real and imagined, tranquilizers to manage anxiety. Dr. Nick kept detailed records, tried to monitor interactions, attempted to prevent overdoses. But he never did the one thing a responsible doctor should have done. He never said no. He never cut Elvis off. He never insisted on rehabilitation. He just kept writing prescriptions. There were close calls, times when Elvis took too many pills and had to be revived, times when dangerous drug combinations nearly killed him. After each incident, Dr. Nick would reduce the dosages, try to implement controls, promise himself this time would be different. But within days or weeks, Elvis would be back to his old patterns, and Dr. Nick would be back to enabling them. By 1975, Dr. Nick could no longer pretend he was helping Elvis. The evidence was overwhelming. Elvis was bloated, barely able to perform, forgetting lyrics, stumbling on stage. His liver was struggling. His heart was showing signs of damage. His cognitive function was impaired. He was, by any medical standard, a very sick man who needed immediate intervention, not more pills. Dr. Nick tried talking to Elvis about getting help, about checking into a treatment facility, about confronting the addiction that was killing him. But Elvis refused to hear it. He wasn't an addict, he insisted. He was under a doctor's care, taking prescription medications for legitimate medical conditions. Street junkies were addicts. Elvis Presley was a patient managing his health with his physician's help. The denial was so complete, so impenetrable, that Dr. Nick gave up trying to break through it. Instead, he focused on damage control, trying to keep Elvis alive while enabling the very behavior that was destroying him. It was an impossible position, and Dr. Nick knew it. He was trapped between his duty to his patient and his fear of losing access, between his medical training and his financial dependence on Elvis. In early 1977, Dr. Nick had a moment of clarity that terrified him. He was sitting in his office, writing out another round of prescriptions for Elvis, and he suddenly understood with absolute certainty that he was watching a patient die in slow motion. That every prescription he wrote brought Elvis one step closer to the grave, that his role as Elvis's doctor had become a role in Elvis's suicide. Dr. Nick cried in his office that day, cried from guilt and shame and helplessness. Then he dried his eyes and finished writing the prescriptions. Because what else could he do? If he stopped, Elvis would just find another doctor. At least this way, Dr. Nick could monitor things, could try to prevent the worst. Or so he told himself. In the final months of Elvis's life, Dr. Nick watched his patient deteriorate rapidly. The medications weren't working anymore. Elvis needed higher and higher doses to achieve any effect. His tolerance had grown so extreme that amounts that would kill a normal person barely registered for him. But his body couldn't sustain this level of chemical assault indefinitely. Elvis was scheduled for another tour in August 1977. Dr. Nick knew Elvis wasn't healthy enough to perform. He should have insisted Elvis cancel the tour, check into a hospital, get serious help. But the tour represented millions of dollars in revenue, jobs for dozens of people, expectations from thousands of fans who'd bought tickets. How could Dr. Nick be the one to shut all that down? On August 15th, 1977, Dr. Nick wrote prescriptions for Elvis that would be among the last. He handed Elvis the bottles of pills, watched him take them, and felt a terrible premonition that something bad was about to happen. But he didn't stop Elvis, didn't insist he get help, just watched him walk away with the pills that would be in his system when he died less than 24 hours later. The next afternoon, the call came. Elvis had been found unresponsive in his bathroom. Paramedics couldn't revive him. Dr. Nick rushed to Graceland, but he already knew the truth. Elvis Presley was dead, and the years of prescription drug abuse that Dr. Nick had enabled were the underlying cause. In the weeks after Elvis's death, Dr. Nick was investigated by medical authorities and law enforcement. The Tennessee Board of Medical Examiners looked into his prescribing practices. The district attorney considered criminal charges. The media portrayed Dr. Nick as a drug dealer with a medical license, someone who'd killed Elvis Presley for money and access to fame. Dr. Nick defended himself by arguing that he'd been trying to manage an impossible situation, that he'd kept Elvis alive longer than anyone else could have, that without his careful monitoring, Elvis would have died years earlier. But even as he made these arguments, Dr. Nick knew they were hollow. He'd enabled Elvis's addiction. He'd prioritized access and income over his patient's welfare. He'd violated the fundamental principle of medicine. First, do no harm. The Tennessee Board of Medical Examiners eventually suspended Dr. Nick's medical license for 3 months, though he was never criminally charged. But the real punishment was internal. Dr. Nick spent the rest of his life knowing he'd failed Elvis Presley, that he'd been given a position of trust and responsibility and had betrayed it, that he'd written the prescriptions that slowly killed the most famous entertainer in the world. In later years, Dr. Nick would occasionally give interviews about his time with Elvis. He would talk about the pressure, the impossible position he'd been in, the systemic failures that allowed Elvis's addiction to flourish. But he would always come back to that first prescription in March 1967, the amphetamines he'd prescribed just to help Elvis get through one show. "That was my biggest mistake," Dr. Nick said in a 1981 interview. "Not the last prescription, not the thousands of pills over the years. The first one. Because once I crossed that line, once I started prioritizing Elvis's performance over Elvis's health, everything else followed. I told myself it was just one time, just to help him through a difficult moment. But there's no such thing as just one time when you're dealing with someone as vulnerable as Elvis was." Dr. George Nichopoulos lived until 2016, dying at age 88. He spent nearly 40 years living with the knowledge that he'd contributed to Elvis Presley's death. He lost his medical license permanently in 1995, not for his treatment of Elvis, but for similar prescribing patterns with other patients. The pattern that started with Elvis in 1967 had become Dr. Nick's standard practice, and eventually the medical establishment said enough. The story of Dr. Nick and Elvis Presley is a story about addiction, but it's also a story about enablement, about the systems that allow addiction to flourish, about the ways professionals can rationalize their participation in someone's self-destruction. Dr. Nick didn't set out to harm Elvis. He genuinely believed he was helping. But good intentions don't prevent tragedy when they're combined with poor judgment and conflicts of interest. Today, the medical profession has stricter guidelines about prescribing controlled substances. Doctors face more oversight, more accountability, more consequences for overprescribing. The opioid epidemic has forced a reckoning with the way prescription drugs can destroy lives even when they come from legitimate medical sources. But these changes came too late for Elvis Presley, who died in 1977 from an addiction that started with one doctor's prescription in 1967. The prescription that changed everything wasn't the last one, but the first. When Dr. Nichopoulos chose performance over health, care turned into malpractice. Elvis might have declined anyway, but those pills made death certain, turning a possible tragedy into an inevitable one. Dr. Nick claimed he did his best, yet he knew that first prescription in 1967 began the chain that ended with Elvis dead at 42, surrounded by pills he prescribed.